Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Drabinski with Ideas on Fire, and I want to welcome you all to today's seminar, Tips for Teaching Toward Inclusive Excellence. So the way this will work is in a second, I will be gone and I'll pull up the slides and we'll work through the slides for today. And then I'll come back and we can have a group chat using this bar on the side of your screen or the Ask a Question feature. And I assume if you're joining us today that you teach and that you think about these issues, and I'm sure you have your own ideas about what makes inclusive excellence in the classroom. So please do share your ideas as well as we work through the slides. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now so you'll be able to see the slides, and I'll see you back here in a little bit. All right, so let me go ahead and start the slideshow. So this webinar is called Tips for Teaching Toward Inclusive Excellence. And we thought it would be a good idea to have this seminar because first it's about teaching well, but also the language of, quote, inclusive excellence is becoming more and more common in the academy. And we wanted to sort of ground it in some practices because this tends to be the language of administration. But what does it mean for those of us who work regularly in the classroom? So on tap today, we're going to first talk about what is inclusive excellence. What do they mean when they use this language with us? Then we'll talk about getting to know yourself and how that helps set up an inclusive classroom. Then we'll talk about inclusive excellence and the syllabus, because that's where a lot of this stuff starts in this document you give your students. We'll then talk about inclusive excellence on day one and how to open your class in a way that sets the tone for a good semester. Then we'll talk about assignments, and then finally what happens in the classroom in a daily way. And then we've got some further resources to share with you, some from Ideas on Fire and some from external sources. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is inclusive excellence? It is a buzzword in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of us, that it's administrators are calling on us to do a certain amount of work to be inclusively excellent. At my institution here in Baltimore, it is now at the top of every administrative agenda. And when I hear it and I learn what it means to administrators, I realize that what they mean is feminist pedagogy, a lot of the work we're already doing. Inclusive excellence is also a teaching philosophy. And for many of us, the tenets of inclusive excellence match our own goals. So once we break through what administrators are talking about, we tend to see that what we're already doing in the classroom is inclusive excellence. And it's also, I think, an orientation, a way of understanding our work, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, a way of understanding that inclusive excellence is about how we approach research, but also service, teaching. Everything we do is about making sure that our work is accessible to as many people as possible. So this is the definition of inclusive excellence from Witham, Malcolm Foucault, Dowd, and Ben Simone. They define it like this. Inclusive excellence is the collective responsibility to equitably engage all students in high-quality, evidence-based educational experiences. And I like the way they talk about collective responsibility, because today we'll be talking about what each of us can do individually in the classroom, but it is something that I think we need to have group conversations about and about what it means. Too often inclusive excellence is something that happens in the gender studies classroom or the ethnic studies classroom, but less so in maybe biology or mathematics. So taking our understanding of inclusive excellence and sharing it with our colleagues in those departments is really important. An institution, back to the quotation, an institution that commits to inclusive excellence intentionally designs experiences to accommodate differences in students' aspirations, life circumstances, ways of engaging and learning and participating in college, and identities as learners and students. So I like this part of the definition because it gets at how we design what happens in the classroom. We don't just roll in and see what they want to talk about, right? We actually can thoughtfully design assignments, class projects in ways that are more or less inclusive. And it's not just about engaging different learning styles. And the research has actually shown that the language of learning styles is not, in the end, that helpful. Students will sometimes tell me they're visual learners or they're auditory learners, and I understand what they're saying, but I also, the research shows that getting students at a lot of different levels is how they learn best. So it's partly about how students think of themselves as learners, but also their experiences, what they bring to the classroom, whether or not they feel they belong, whether or not they feel like they have a voice they can share. So inclusive excellence is really about thinking about students as whole people, and that they bring that whole person to our classroom, even if it's only for 50 minutes. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of inclusive excellence is that part of what we have to do is get to know ourselves and how our own positionality shapes how we see students and how they see us. If we teach in identity-based interdisciplines, we're likely really familiar with this, like the idea that that as a woman, my students are reacting to me in a certain way, that my whiteness shapes how students of different racial groups are going to see me in the classroom, and will also shape how I see students, the sort of internal biases that I have to work through. So understanding that positionality, I think, is the very first step towards inclusive excellence. So some questions to ask oneself when doing this kind of reflective work is, first, how does your background shape how you see students? And what questions can you ask yourself to learn about your own biases? And this is some of the hardest work, especially if we occupy positions of relative privilege. So, for example, I'm a cisgender woman. I'm currently teaching an Introduction to Transgender Studies class. And about half of my students are transgender, identify as transgender or non-binary or genderqueer. And I know that that reality for me of my cisgenderness shapes how I teach and I have blind spots, things that I just can't understand about the experiences of my transgender students. So understanding that is really important to shaping a classroom experience that is inclusive for my trans and my cis students, right? Understanding, and so ways that I deal with that, right, are first to stay as current as possible in not only the research, but also in the kind of stuff my students are interacting with, things like blogs about identity, so that I can at least know some things about sort of where they're at. Also, being open with my students about my own position and understanding that sometimes I'm going to need them to help me see things I can't see. That, and being really transparent about that with my students, has helped, I think, make that classroom a better experience for all of us. So in another vein, my whiteness, I know, and the way that I've grown up in a society that's based in white supremacy shapes how I see students of color. And I have to actively work against some of those biases. And that's a lifetime project, and that I have to work on, right? And to try and see my students as varied, but all in their way, learners in my classroom. So that's part of it. Also, I'm a lesbian and I'm out in the classroom, and I have to be aware of how that's going to shape how I see students in, say, my sexuality studies classroom, and making sure that I don't isolate some voices over others based on what I want to hear. But this is also really important in terms of thinking about how you're seen in the classroom and how their perception of us shapes what they learn. So in my transgender studies classroom, the fact of my cisgenderness shapes, I think, a lot of how my students see me. And part of what I have to do is establish trust with students, that I'm open to their perspectives, that I understand where they have epistemic privilege that I don't have, right? So being really transparent with my students, I think, welcomes them in. There are also ways that students might see me that I don't have control over, right? So being a woman, for example, means that some students might not take what I say as seriously as they would take what a man would say. Course evaluations are widely understood to be biased against women. There's not a whole lot I can do about that in the classroom, but on a structural level, bringing that up in conversations at administrative levels about promotion and contract renewal is really important. Making sure that at least the administration understands that there's a lot about our own identities that shapes how students interact with us that we can't necessarily control. Sometimes I think it's good to just name that stuff in the classroom if things get really hard, or if there's a kind of identity-based conflict. Bringing in somebody from the outside, your chair, is probably the best person to help mediate those conflicts with students, is really important. All right, next I wanted to talk about the syllabus. And I know we all joke about how nobody reads the syllabus, but the thing is that they do. They just don't reread it. They don't necessarily remember things. And increasingly, at least where I teach, our syllabi are becoming books in themselves with the number of things we're required to add to the syllabus. That said, I think that the syllabus is a place to start off on the right foot. It sets the stage for the rest of the class. So when working on the syllabus, it's important to consider content. What do you teach? Who are the authors on your syllabus? Assessment practices, sort of what kinds of assignments are you giving, and how do you assess in ways that enable a greater number of your students to be successful at some point, right? So one thing I've noticed in my own teaching is that I tend to assign the same kind of assignments over and over again. And that means if you're good at that kind of assignment, you're going to get an A in my class. But if you're not, you won't, right? So thinking about having multiple kinds of assessments is really important. And also having really clear course expectations so that students have a sense that they understand what's happening as they go in. So just a couple more things I wanted to say about the syllabus. When I say consider content, I really mean consider the backgrounds of the authors that you teach. So to go back to my transgender studies class, I make sure that the majority of the authors in that class are transgender or gender nonconforming, because I think that's really important that those voices are prioritized. I also make sure to include intersectional voices, people from different age groups, different countries, different racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, ability status, trying to get a full range of sort of representations in the content. And that's important not only because that's important to understanding the field, but also when students see what's assigned, especially in classes like this, they want to see that there's something about them, right? Or there's something that says, hey, I see you and I want to talk to you, right? So having a syllabus where the content itself is inclusively excellent is really important. Now, that's easier to do, I think, in an identity-based class. But I think you can also do it in classes in STEM classes, making sure that that you include work by women, for example, in an engineering class, making sure that in examples that you use that they're gender inclusive, things like that can be done, and it should be on the syllabus on the first day. In terms of assessment practices, I talked a bit about already about having different kinds of ways things are assessed, like not just essays, but also maybe have class projects that are not writing based, or thinking about having quizzes. And one thing that the literature has shown in terms of inclusive excellence is that students do best when they have a lot of regular assessment that's fairly low stakes. It takes a lot of the pressure off of individual assignments, and it gives students a lot of different ways and times to shine. And then in terms of course expectations, I think not only on the syllabus should you, have your due dates for things, but think about what your policies mean in terms of inclusive excellence. So, for example, what is your attendance policy, and how does your attendance policy flex to allow for uh, the experiences that a lot of our students have that impact their attendance? So, for example, I have a fairly strict attendance policy simply because a lot of the learning happens in the classroom, in a discussion-based classroom. But I also make it clear on the syllabus that if something comes up that's going to keep you out of class for a long time, and these include things like a chronic illness, depression, social anxiety, childcare issues, something like that, to please get in touch with me so that we can work out a solution. And I try to make myself, as a teacher, as available as possible for those things and as understanding as possible. I still don't have great answers on how to have an attendance policy that is open enough, that it's not ableist, but it's sort of an open discussion. But think about what matters to you about students being in class. And in my experience, not having an attendance policy, for example, I don't have an attendance policy in my transgender studies class, and the attendance is really high there. It's not just about the policy that gets them in class. So you can also consider not having one at all and seeing how that goes. Another issue in terms of policies is late policies for work. And there are a couple schools of thought about this. Do you want to have a late policy that's very, very strict to teach students that in the real world, quote unquote, I would argue we're in the real world all the time, but in the quote real world, they need practice at hitting deadlines? Or do you want to have some flexibility there, which I would argue is much more like real life? At most jobs, if you need an extra couple days because something comes up that's a bigger issue at work, most of the time there's flexibility about that. So this is what I do with late policies that I think is working pretty well. I have a late policy that everyone can ask for an extension up to 24 hours in advance, and the extension is a week, and no questions asked. So rather than having a bunch of emails about a crisis situation or something, and stuff comes up for students, and it's okay to be flexible about this. I think it's more inclusive. So as long as you ask 24 hours in advance, you get a week's extension. And what this has done, I've done this for a few years now, and what this has done is it helps students learn to ask for what they need, which is also an important life skill. And it has taken, it sort of releases a pressure from the classroom that's really helpful. And finally, it spreads out my grading a little bit. Some people don't like that. I really like that, I think, because of the number of students I'm dealing with at a time. So the syllabus, so that's an example of a policy that you can sort of tweak and think about what would make it inclusive, like how would it recognize the range of humanity that might be in your classroom. Finally, another thing I think is important to add to your syllabus that signals to students that this is a classroom of inclusivity is information about things like mental health supports on campus, supports for survivors of sexual violence, and supports for students with disabilities. Having that stuff on the syllabus lets students know that you care about them as full human beings. And I think that's part of inclusive excellence as well. This stuff is all, of course, debatable, and it's really hard to figure out how to balance a syllabus that lets students know that they're all welcome as full human beings while not becoming a book that no one could read, or losing any sense of standards. So it's a balancing act, but I think these are my tips for making a syllabus that is more inclusive. All right, let's talk about the first day of class. This is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of making an educational space for students and for yourself that's going to feel good, right? And feel good because it's inclusive of everybody. So here's some tips for that first day of class. First, get to know your students. This is hard to do if you are teaching the place where you've got a giant lecture class, but most class, hopefully your class has enough time for some kind of introductions. And to get to know your students, my recommendation is to let students introduce themselves. One of the things that happens at a lot of places is you get your student list from the registrar's office or from whatever software your campus uses, and that information is sometimes not accurate in terms of who's in your class. And what I mean by this is the last thing I want to do in my class is call someone by a name that they do not use. And the school where I teach, for example, it's fairly easy to change your name in the system, but not all students know how to do that, especially first-year students, or have had the time to do it, or are ready to do it. So letting students introduce themselves helps you avoid the problem of saying somebody's name that's not their name anymore, or of mispronouncing a name. Mispronouncing a name is a sign for a lot of students that they're not as important, or that their sort of background is too complicated for you. So you can just avoid that altogether by having students introduce themselves. Part of that introduction can include sharing pronouns. And there are a couple schools of thought about the pronoun circle in classrooms and meetings. One school of thought is asking everyone to share their pronouns can unintentionally out students who aren't ready for that, right? So if I say, I use these pronouns and maybe I use they, them pronouns, it's outing me as non-binary, I might not want to do that, right? So it can be scary for some students to be put on the spot like that. Another issue that some people have with the pronoun sharing is that it has become sort of rote and students don't really understand why we're doing it. And I know that I've done this in a lot of classes, and students will say things like, what's a pronoun? Or I don't care, use any pronoun you want, or they'll snicker and laugh. So I think for inclusive excellence, signaling to our trans, non-binary, genderqueer students that we understand that we don't know their gender by looking at them is super duper important. So my recommendation for the pronoun circle is to explain to students why we're doing it. And increasingly, I've noticed teachers not doing that anymore. And I think that there's a danger in that. So I just tell students, share your pronouns if you wish. And the if you wish gives students a way to not share them if they don't want to or they're not ready to. And then I explain to them why we're doing it. You can't tell somebody's gender by looking at them, and we want to be respectful of who people are, so we're sharing pronouns. Another way to get to know your students is to have an icebreaker, and those icebreaker questions can signal a lack of inclusive excellence if you're not careful. So asking something like, where did you go on vacation, assumes everybody has a vacation and goes somewhere. And those are some very classed assumptions. So some icebreakers that I found that work better are things like, share a highlight or a low light from your summer. It's very open, or tell us something that you want us to know about you. And then people often will say things like, my favorite color is blue. Something that's a bit more open and gives students some room in terms of how vulnerable they need to be on that first day. You can also, so some people don't like to use icebreakers at all because they require everyone to speak. I have found that for my introverted students, having something set up where they have permission to hear their own voices in the room is a really positive way to start off, and let them know that that's a way to be in the classroom. So the last thing here I'll say about inclusive excellence is use part of your class time to set ground rules as a class for what discussion is going to look like. This gives students some sense of ownership over the process, and it lets students who experience class discussion sometimes as triggering or violent to have some sense that there are some rules about how we're going to deal with what happens in the classroom if someone says something that offends somebody else or hurts somebody's feelings. So those ground rules throughout the semester can be good to go back to ensure that the classroom remains inclusive of students who might be facing those issues. Next, I think it's really helpful to let students get to know you a little bit. And this, I think, is very personal at the teaching level, sort of what kind of teacher you are. I'm a pretty open book in the classroom. I have found it works really well for me to feel comfortable with my students and for them to connect with me, but I understand that that's my teaching personality. I will say that when you do those icebreaker questions and the pronoun questions, answer them as well. So I'll often ask questions like, why are you taking this class? And I always say, if it's just for the gen ed credit or whatever, that's fine. I just want to have a sense of who's in the room and what they're looking to know. And then I answer that question when it's my turn about why I'm teaching this class. So that signals to students that you're on the same team. Next, consider the physical space of your classroom. How's it set up and for whom? Is there enough room for the student's wheelchair? Is there enough room for, are there enough left-handed desks in the room? Are we sitting in a circle or are we sitting in rows? And is there space at the front of the classroom for people who need it? Like, just trying to be mindful of the physical setup is really important. And I know for a lot of us, we don't have much control over that, right? If we're teaching in a room where all the seats are bolted to the floor, even simply acknowledging that you understand the limits of the space can help students feel like even if their needs can't be met because of infrastructure, you understand that they have needs. And that's, again, part of signaling your inclusivity. So it's a rare class that that I teach, that issues of disability don't come up, right? We often talk about how our built space makes an argument for who belongs there. So when the desk is a certain size, it's making an argument for what size bodies should be. And sort of noting that kind of stuff sometimes can be helpful for students. Also, if you're able to move desks or to reserve left-handed desks for students who are left-handed, that can be really helpful. Finally, consider the course materials you choose. Now, I don't think that book prices are the reason students are in massive debt. I think that's one cost, but the bigger cost is tuition and fees. But book prices really do matter, often because financial aid doesn't cover that. So financial aid might cover all, and loans might cover all of their tuition, but they're on their own for books. So one way to signal that you're inclusive of people who cannot necessarily purchase materials is first to use open access resources, so students aren't required to buy anything at all. If you want them to purchase and read books, make sure to use the reserve system at the library so that students who can't afford to buy the book can still read it and access it. I learned this semester that most of my students don't understand what course reserves mean, and so that's something that you need to articulate to the class. So for years I've had on my syllabus, the book is on reserve at the library, assuming they knew what that meant. And then I asked them, so do you know what I mean when I say the books are on reserve, and discover that they don't. So make sure you explain how reserves work, and make sure that you put your books on reserve enough in advance that they're ready for the first day of class. And then finally, be transparent with your students about what's important to purchase. If you assign a book, but you're only going to read 3 chapters of it, let them know that that this might be a book they could take from the library and just copy those 3 chapters. I always explain to my students, I teach an activism class, and I always assign this book about Baltimore history. And I say to them, we're only going to read 1 chapter. It's a great book. If you're interested in history, buy it. But if not, it's okay to share or use the library. And I think students really appreciate that information up front. All right, let's talk about course assignments. First, consider your course goals when you think about what kind of assignments you're going to do. What do you want students to be able to do? This was a revelatory idea for me when I finally took a pedagogy class long after graduate school. Rather than design a syllabus based on what I want students to read because I think it's good reading, it's much better to design a syllabus and assignments around what I want students to be able to do. So if what you want students to be able to do is write a research paper, part of inclusive excellence is understanding that not all students understand what a research paper is when they start your class. So think about how you can scaffold assignments to get them there. And the scaffolding also gives students a lot of ways to show what they know and have learned. And it brings because the final research paper that's worth 75% of your grade, that's really overwhelming. But if you break that down into a topics assignment, an outline assignment, annotated bibliography, like a bunch of different assignments that scaffold into the end product, that is really, really helpful for students. Next, make sure you vary assessments. I already talked about this a bit, but offer multiple ways to earn points to meet students where they are. Class participation is one of these kinds of assessments that a lot of us have on our syllabus, but thinking about varying what counts as participation is important. Not all students are. So one thing that I do in my class is I ask students who struggles to talk in class. And I say, and if you raise your hand, I promise I won't call on you to explain, because they often think that if they raise their hand, they're like setting themselves up. So I say, I'm not going to call on you. I just want to get a sense. And then I ask the class as a whole, what are some reasons why participation might be hard for students? And that generally generates a pretty good list of reasons, and then we can talk through them. And then I talk to them about ways of participating that are not just about talking in class. Things like being seen actively taking notes, participating in small group discussions, coming to office hours, writing emails when you need to, things like that for clarification. Those all are things that sort of count as participation. And then also think through your policies. We talked about lateness already. Plagiarism policies, I think, are another place where you can signal to students that that it's an inclusive classroom. And what I mean by that is I always tell students that, in my experience, students plagiarize because they get overwhelmed with work, they lack confidence in their writing skills, and so they're scared they won't be able to do it. Those are really the 2 biggest reasons that students plagiarize, in my experience. And talking about that, and then talking about why citation is important, like the ethics of it, is a way of also saying to them, hey, the same way this is an inclusive classroom for you, it needs to be an inclusive classroom for the authors that we read and the texts that we read. So I talk to students about the history of how citation practices have often not cited women or people of color, and other people have taken credit for their ideas. And that's an ethical and political problem, and we're not going to reproduce it, right? So we're going to follow proper citation practices. So this is a way to talk about plagiarism that isn't just purely don't cheat and I'm a cop, but it's a way of talking about it as a human problem, right? So if you're struggling, you're overwhelmed, send me an email, meet with me, and we'll talk about some strategies together. Once plagiarism happens, right, it turns a student into into a criminal and me into a police officer. These are my least favorite subject positions. So I try and headed off at the pass. Plagiarism still happens, but a plagiarism policy that clearly articulates the ethical reasons why it's important not to plagiarize, I think, is helpful for the inclusive classroom. And then finally, when you're working on course assignments, think about how you suggest resources, and make sure that all students are informed about things like the writing center, tutoring, stuff that can help them. So thinking about writing, I teach at a public school where people come from a huge range of backgrounds. Some have been given lots of opportunities to work on their writing for their entire educational career, and others very, very little. So talking to them about how to recognize those inequalities and how the university with its learning resource center, its writing center, and with me in office hours, I can help you improve your writing. Like I'm not punishing you for not having that background. I recognize you don't have it, and I can help you improve some aspect of your writing over the course of the semester. Just being transparent with students about that and the resources that are available to them is important for signaling to students that regardless of what you perceive as your skill level, you can be successful in this class. So let's talk about what we do in the classroom itself to be inclusively excellent. So the first suggestion I have is to model classroom culture. What does and should engagement look like in your classroom? And this is where I return to the ground rules that you and your students set together on the first or second day of class. What are we going to do when someone's offended? So in my experience, students, I talk openly about how it's very likely that there will be microaggressions in this class because that's the world we live in. And so how are we going to deal with them? And students have great ideas about this because they spend a lot more time in classrooms than we do. We go to the same 2, 3, 4 a week, but they're in a bunch of classes and they have a much better sense about what works. So students have said things like, recognize that we're all here to learn and a lot of us don't know things. That's why we're here. So in the transgender studies class, for example, when people use language that is out of date, we decided as a class that when that happens, we will correct people and then we will move on. And that we will not let it disrupt the whole classroom. So that's really helpful. But then also how you treat students and how you ask questions and how you say go through readings with them. That's all part of modeling how classroom engagement should look. Next, I want to talk about group work. Group work is really important for a lot of our classes. If you teach a discussion-based class, having small group discussion within the larger group discussion, I think gives students another way to participate that they can't have if we're all in the same large group discussion all the time. So some tips for inclusive group work. First, assign groups. When we make groups, if we let students pick their own groups, students tend to pick people they know or whose ideas they already share. So they cut down the diversity of ideas in their small group. It leaves out students who might not be extroverted enough to grab a group. Also for students, so for example, I have a deaf student in a class right now, and to ask him and his interpreters to choose a group can be a bit awkward. So I just assign groups. That gets around a lot of those issues. Also, small group work works best when there's some structure. So for example, ask students, tell them exactly what you want them to do in the group. The structure helps them learn better. So introduce yourselves to each other, pick someone to take notes, and I will often say, don't let it just be the only woman in the group, right? Because women aren't just secretaries. So signaling that I recognize that might happen, and someone who's going to do the report back to the class. And once they've got those roles assigned, it makes the report backs a lot easier. Give the group some concrete goals, like give them a passage and say, as a group, rewrite this passage in a way that's more accessible. That's the kind of assignment I might do in a theory class. give them a set of discussion questions, right? Answer these 3 questions. Or sometimes I'll have groups of students read different parts of the text, and I'll put them in smaller groups and say, okay, what are the 3 main things students who didn't read this should know before moving on? So giving really concrete goals rather than like one big question, talk amongst yourselves, can make that group work more productive. But finally, recognize that sometimes small groups can hurt. So in classes where the subject material is really sensitive, putting people in small groups with other people who might not necessarily share everybody's background, or that can be really challenging. So if the material is really sensitive about, say, violence or race or gender or sexuality, sometimes I'll avoid doing small groups just so that there's not a small group that I lose track of that goes off the rails and creates a really negative experience for a student who's who's minoritized. So small groups are great. With structure, they're great. I think assigning them is really important rather than letting them choose themselves, but also recognize when it's not a good idea. Next, let there be quiet in the classroom. So I've talked quite a bit about identity-based issues, but also people learn really differently. So when we ask questions of a class, it's often hard to sit with the silence. Anything more than about 3 seconds, and I start to get really uncomfortable. But remember that a lot of students need time to collect their thoughts, and part of the inclusive classroom is giving them that time. So some strategies for this is to give them 2 minutes to write. And I always set a time limit on it because it can students write at different speeds, but setting a time limit of like 2 minutes is enough time for students to write down some thoughts. This helps students prepare to share in larger class discussion, but it also gives them a way to participate even if they don't share vocally, just giving them time and space to write for a little bit. And then finally, request feedback from students. Be open to the students shaping their classroom culture to meet their needs. So consider things like a midterm evaluation, where you're just asking students things like, what about the structure of class is helping you learn, and name one thing that could help you learn better. And sometimes the information isn't necessarily super helpful, but the mere act of asking signals to your students that you respect them as learners and respect how they want to shape the classroom. And often really good stuff comes out of there. Sometimes it's half and half. Half the students are like more small groups and half are like never a small group again. So that can be challenging, but signaling to them that you're open to that is important. All right, so those are sort of my thoughts on creating inclusive classrooms from the syllabus through classes themselves, but there are a lot of other resources that go a lot more in depth and have a lot of different ideas about how to do this well. The first is a link to the Inclusive Excellence projects happening at Tufts University, and it's just a good clearinghouse for a lot of different articles and a lot of information that I think can be really helpful. There's also an excellent article at the Chronicle of Higher Education that's linked here with a lot of practical teaching tips, so things to do in the classroom to maximize the inclusivity of the space. And then Ideas on Fire has a couple of resources that I thought might be helpful. One is about accessibility, and it's specifically about how to make an event accessible, but it's the tips and techniques there are definitely transferable to your classrooms. And then we have a webinar on syllabus writing that's student-centered, and it's called Writing a Student-Centered Syllabus to Save You Time. So it recognizes that sometimes these strategies are really time-consuming, and how can we write an inclusive syllabus that actually relieves some of our workload, because emotionally teaching toward inclusive excellence can be a lot of work. All right, so that's our webinar for today, and I'm about to come back to the screen and see what ideas you have. All right. Hello. So I'm back, and just wondering if anybody had any tips or ideas that they use for this idea of inclusive excellence, or what I would call good feminist teaching, or issues that come up in your classroom about this, or any particular struggles or issues you have in the classroom. Remember how I said I'm not that good at silence? This is me being not that good at silence. I'll tell you about an experience I had just yesterday in one of my classes. Apropos of absolutely nothing, we were talking about Stonewall. A student raised her hand and said, but transgender people have it better in prison, right? I mean, I went to prison once and I saw that the transgender people had a nail salon. So it came out of nowhere, and it was about half the class did this audible gasp, and it was one of those classroom management moments where I want the student who said that I don't want to alienate her from the class. I want to teach her that that's incorrect, but we'll be discussing it later in the class. But I also want to signal to the other students that I understand how wrong she is, and so it was really tricky. And I just said to the classroom, I said, "Wow, a lot of landmines today. This is really hard." And I acknowledged that, and it instantly let air out of the room. And then I said, "Thank you for sharing. I want to tell you that that's a misperception, and here's some evidence, but we'll be talking about it later." So just acknowledging it and leaving some space for for all of us to not hate that student or be angry, and to not get that student to totally close off, to just do a kind of soft educative thing, I think was helpful. But when stuff like that happens in the classroom, you can't let it go, because if you do, you're teaching it, and no one would let it go, but you have to actually shut it down. And that's something that's taken me a long time to learn, to just be able to say to a student, that's incorrect, and here's why, but in a way with some openness and kindness. So that's one example of the kind of stuff that happens in the classroom. All right, well, it was really nice to have you join me today. And if you're watching this on tape delay, hi, we missed you. Do look at those links that are posted in the further resources on the slides, because I think they'll really help with some practical tips. So happy teaching, everyone. And the administrators, hopefully they'll come to understand that the stuff we're doing that we consider good teaching is exactly what they want us all to be doing. So good on us. All right, good luck, and I'll see you next month for our next webinar.